Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Pittsburgh Sports Memories. As usual, I'm your host, Steve Wirt, and I'm with my regular co-host.
I am Tim Hannon.
And today we're going to be covering on this episode, we're going to be covering Jamie Dixon. And yeah, I'm sure everybody remembers him. It's only been since 2016. So what is that? At this point, was that 6 years, 5 years, 6 years, somewhere in there? But I call it. He probably actually what he made Pitt basketball relevant. So he was a childhood actor, but he was unlike Todd Bridges, or Danny Bonaducci. He actually made a career for himself, but not as an actor, but as a basketball coach. He kind of came out of nowhere. He was an unknown coach at UCSB, I guess the University of Cal State Berkeley, and then he was at Hawaii for like a little bit, and then Ben Howland brought him into Pitt, and that's kind of when his career really came to prominence. So a little background on Jamie Dixon. He was born in Burbank. He was actually recruited by Ben Howland in college. I did not realize Ben Howland was that much older than him. Did you realize that?
No, no, I didn't. I mean, they both kind of came to prominence around the same time, so I just kind of assumed they were. I knew Jamie Dixon was younger, but not that much younger.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the few recruiting battles Ben Howland lost out on, he actually lost out on him, and he went to TCU, and which is kind of weird because he grew up in LA, but I guess LA to Texas isn't that far. It's Dallas, Los Angeles to Dallas. So, and he attended TCU, and he had a very successful college career. He played point guard, but he came off the bench a lot, and he earned some all conference honors. I don't know what conference. It might have been the Southwest Conference back then. That old conference. What would they have? Arkansas and Texas A&M, and like the old Southwest Conference.
Yeah, I
So
thought like Texas and Oklahoma and all those
was Oklahoma in that
or
conference?
were they in the Big Eight with Nebraska and those guys? Yeah,
I think they
I'm not
might have.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
good
in
call.
Colorado. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Because the Southwest was like Arkansas, was it? I remember that was like one of the early, like when conference alignment came in. So that won't be the last time we talk about conference alignment in this podcast. So um, he actually there's a highlight of him hitting a shot with 2 seconds left to beat the University of Texas. So imagine TCU and Texas. That's a big rivalry down there in Texas land. So ironically enough, he became a pro basketball player in the CBA, and then he went and played in New Zealand. After he played for a team in La Crosse, Wisconsin, for the at the what that was at lower level of the like the minor league of college basketball for like a minute before they went under, and then he went and played New Zealand, which was ironic enough. And then he didn't start head coaching after he had some coaching experience in New Zealand, but then he went to that like I said, UCSB, and I guess they were him and Ben Howland were both at that Cal Berkeley. So and he became an assistant at Pitt in '99 with Ben Howland. So
Steve,
what?
Steve,
Yeah.
that shot he hit in college, I think, isn't it called like the Jamie Dixon Miracle?
Yes, it is. I actually have a link to it. We can attach that. I mean, unless we really, I mean, yeah,
Yeah, we'll
we'll
post it on
like,
the website, but like that was a
yeah,
big deal at the time. Like the play actually had a
yeah,
name.
yeah, yeah. He's like a legend down at TCU. So, and that's another thing that's going to come into play.
Spoilers. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So he's a very. It's like Levance Fields or Brandon Knight or kind of like one of those players. But for TCU, then that was JB Dixon. So, um, He was an assistant until 2003 with Pitt, and then he was promoted to head coach after Ben Howland left. After we did a podcast on it on that season, that was the game against Dwayne Wade Marquette. So it was kind of like a desperation hire. I think they just wanted to keep everything the same, and Pitt might have been in between athletic directors at that time, between Steve Peterson and Jeff Long. I don't remember the timing there, but it was kind of like just like, well, this guy's been coaching the team, kind of. Let's just stick with him. And they kept all the other assistants. Most importantly, a guy named Barry Roberson, who could really recruit New York. So, what had been going on at Pitt basketball? Well, they did not have very much success. Pitt was definitely solidly a football school for most of its existence until I would say 1999, or well, not even 99. I would say like 2000s when Howland started winning. They had made a Final Four in 1941, but it wasn't the NCAA, which was weird. It was like some other athletic conference, which was just like athletic. What would I call it? Association? I don't I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't the NCAA. And then they did, when they were in the NCAA in 1974, they made an Elite Eight, but not really much sustained success. They had a little run with I think it was Charles Smith in the 80s, the Barry Keane game. And I remember they played Utah in like '93, and Jerry Tarkanian was coaching Utah at that point, and they lost, and they were like, and they weren't in the tournament for like, my goodness, for like 7 or 8 years after that. They just were not in the NCAA tournament. And they weren't even close. It wasn't like they were just missing. They are just a very mediocre to bad basketball program.
Yeah, we talked about the you're right. They had some good teams in the '80s, and then the '90s were really really miserable. And then who was the coach? Ralph Willard, the guy before
Yeah,
Allen. He finally got this program in '98 to be like in a decent spot, and they had all these really big wins at the beginning of that season, and then they lost that UConn game, the Khalid Al-Amin jumped on the score table game, and it just collapsed from there. And that was Pitt basketball. Like, oh, maybe they're gonna be good, and then wah, wah, wah. Like it just
yeah,
wasn't. They were just totally, totally irrelevant.
yeah, pretty much. So, I pretty much sums it up for Pitt basketball. So going over like some low points, like instead of just chronologically going through this, we'll kind of do like, well, I know we did a good, the bad, and the ugly with Pitt, but this will be different. It'll be like more low points and high points. So, bad, low points. We'll start with the bad. We'll get the bad out of the way, and we're just gonna get this out of the way early because this is really painful. In 2008, 2009, they probably had their best team, and Scotty Reynolds for Villanova basically hit a shot with, I forget how many seconds left on the clock, but it was basically they ran a hook and lateral. If you watch the play, it's a hook and lateral play from football. Like they inbound the ball, and for some reason, Levance Fields, like it's the old like what Kentucky did with Duke, where they didn't put anybody on Grant Hill. It's kind of the same situation where nobody was really guarding the inbounding pass, and then he passed it into a player who tipped it to Scotty Reynolds, who used like the guy tipping it as like a pick to rub off on, I forget who was guarding him, Jerron Brown, or it was one of their good defenders, but then he just ran down the floor and hit a shot, and that was it. Pitt never made it to the Final Four, and that was probably, I would say that was their second best. Maybe that was their best. Would you think that was their best chance to make the Final Four, Tim?
Well, I mean, they were in the final seconds of the Elite Eight, so I feel like
The game
yeah,
was tied. It wasn't. They weren't leading.
right. But still, I
Yeah.
mean, that was if you want to talk about like the closest they got, like they're tied in the final seconds of an Elite Eight game. So I mean, that was the farthest they got, and was it their best team? I don't know, but it was the farthest they got. So they were right there. They were right on the cusp, and that hurt. That was the year that the Steelers won the Super Bowl and the Penguins won the Stanley Cup, and that happened right in between those two events. And man, wouldn't that have been like Pitt in the
That would
Final
have been a
Four?
that would have been a heck of a sports year. And all like you said, all like happening like, February Super Bowl, March or April, the Final Four, and then the Stanley Cup in like June. That would have been incredible.
It would have been.
So, more like bad stuff. Losing to Pacific and Bradley, those are two different games in the tournament. That was pretty bad. I think they were like 8 and 9 seeds that year. So, they weren't like a high seed when they lost to those teams. Actually, I'm looking it up right now. Pacific, they were a 9 seed. Bradley, they were a 5 seed, and Bradley was a 13. I don't think a 5-13 is a huge upset in the tournament, but it's still like they probably should have won both those games.
All I remember about the Bradley game was that CBS on the broadcast, they had a little box like in the corner that showed the score, and they had it, the school is abbreviated BRAD and then PITT. So, and they had
Brad,
yeah, it just said Brad Pitt the whole game. Brad Pitt, 64-62.
yeah, nice. I think that was the game too. Krauser hit somebody. He like totally cheap shotted somebody too.
That's
So
a shocker.
yeah, I
That
know.
guy was such a classy player, and what's it not?
Um, another like not great moment for Pitt was they lost to Wisconsin in 2016. That was actually Jamie Dixon's last game, and they only scored 43 points, and they lost in the first round. Once again, I'm not sure what their seeding was. They were a 10 seed, and Wisconsin was a 7 seed, so Wisconsin was a higher seed, but it would have been nice to score more than 43 points. It's just it was kind of a ugh there. So they lost to Wichita State in 2013 also, but I think Wichita State ended up going pretty far that year. So um, they lost to Butler in 2010, and this is like I don't know like how like it's a bad loss, but at the same time like Butler was a really good team. Like Butler almost won the national championship. That was their second year going to the national championship game, and they almost won both times. So I'm not sure like I necessarily chalk that up to, oh, this is just such a horrible loss. I think if I always thought if they would have had Dwan Blair, he would have stayed an extra season. They beat this team, and probably this is the team that probably makes it to the Final Four. And this is a frustrating game because Gilbert Brown, the game was tie or no, Butler was up by 1, and Gilbert Brown has the ball and is like driving, and like the guy from Butler fouls him for no reason. So all he has to do is hit 2 foul shots and Pitt wins basically. So I think he hits the first one and ties it, or I can't remember. I think he may have missed both. I can't remember he missed both, but he hits one, and then on the second one, his second shot, the ball goes up in the air, and Nasir Robinson fouls this Matt Howard, who was like this big, I don't know how to describe him, what was the derpy white guy, who like seriously, that was the guy. If they would have had DeJuan Blair, he would have ate him. Like they almost beat, like they would have had no answer for DeJuan Blair. That guy wouldn't have been, and DeJuan Blair would have been the big NBA star. He would have got every call. They would have won this game. They just would have. And so all the guy had to do was hit 1 foul shot to win the game, which he did. So yeah, so Gilbert Brown hit like 1 foul shot and missed the second. And then they literally foul him like it wasn't defensive. They were on the other end of the court. So it's like, why do you foul a guy like what 100, 200 feet from your own basket? It was ridiculous. So he hits 1 shot and he purposely misses the second, and Butler wins on the most insane ending. Do you remember that too?
Yeah, I think we covered that in our top 20 in-game mistakes
Oh
podcast.
yeah.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. I mean, it was just and the guy for Butler really made the mistake before that.
Yeah,
So
fouling, yeah.
yeah, so I mean, it was like, and that kid, I did feel bad for him because yeah, I mean, that was just rough. I mean, he just made a mistake, and boy, it was a really big mistake. It lost him their season.
And I really honestly always thought that team probably would have made it to the Final Four, probably. And
Well,
especially if Dewan Blair stays.
yeah, if Dewan Blair was and he was an NBA player, so I understand why he wanted to go to the NBA. But you know, Butler was the team that made it out of that bracket. So you make it past Butler, and presumably you've taken out at that point the best team in the bracket. So yeah, they really would have had a good chance.
So I guess that's enough crying about losing to Butler. They were a good team. So it's not like it's an embarrassing loss. Like it's like, oh my gosh, you lost to like Bradley, who's Bradley or Pacific. Is it they were a good team. It's just like they had them beat and they just couldn't hang on. So and probably like I say this is the worst loss, and this is probably the one that kind of I think everybody kind of lost like faith in Jamie Dixon after this, and I guess we'll just share it here. I'll share it for your listening pleasure.
Guarded by Wanamaker with 10 seconds to go. Coombs McDaniel on the screen. Walker with 7.
Got a mismatch.
Walker on McGee with 4. Kemba Walker. Step back. Walker. Cardiac Kemba does it again. UConn wins at the buzzer.
So, if you can't tell, what happened was they had Brad Wanamaker, who was a really good defender, and he's guarding Kemba Walker, and that's probably the matchup you want, right, Tim?
Yes.
Well, would you say you don't want Gary McGee guarding Kemba Walker?
Is that who was guarding him?
Yeah, and I mean, if you watch the highlight, we'll put this link on there. Like Gary McGee is like a good center and a good big man, but like Kemba Walker's a really good guard, and he's in the NBA and really good in the NBA. Why did you switch there? Just stay on him. Like Wanamaker should have stayed on him, and that was like the worst. Now I don't know if you can blame Dixon for that or Gary McGee, but yeah, or Brad. You just cannot switch like that with that player. that was, and I think like because I remember after that happened, everybody was really mad at JB Dixon for that because that really is like kind of a coaching faux pas. And like when you listen to that replay, you can hear the guy calls it. He's like, "Oh, they got a mismatch on Walker." So I don't know. It wasn't Gary McGee shouldn't have been guarding him.
Yeah, that one hurt. I mean, that was those Big East tournament games and the championship games. I mean, you always wanted to win those, especially UConn. Like especially in the UConn, I think that just always hurts. You know, watching Calhoun celebrate in that clip just makes me like clench my fists a little bit more.
And I still think that's worse than the Butler. Just I don't know why. I think maybe just because we like the Big East tournament so much and everything. But I just always thought, the Scotty Reynolds is probably worse than that one. But that one was just more infuriating. Like Scotty Reynolds was a good player, and Villanova is always really good at basketball. But it's just like, that one definitely hurt. So that's enough like crying about Pitt basketball losses. Let's go to the good. So the good stuff. That would be Jamie Dixon has a 328 all-time wins. And that would be second all-time at Pitt, believe it or not, which is hard to believe. When I looked that up. He did that in 13 years. Now there's a coach named Doc Carlson. He has 366 wins. But can you guess how long it took him to do that, Tim?
Doc Carlson, I have no idea.
30 years. 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and he was like, they took like basketball was such a joke to them. Like I think he was actually in charge of like he's an actual doctor, and he was just like, yeah, he was like in charge of like the student health or whatever, like the student health center or something. And it's like, hey, you want to coach some basketball games? All right, I like basketball. I'm a doctor. Anybody gets hurt, I can help them. But I think he was more than that. He actually did like have some offense and stuff, but still, Pitt was obviously not taking basketball very seriously back then. But So more good things that happened while Jamie Dixon was at Pitt. So 328. I would say Jamie Dixon's probably the best coach at Pitt. I mean, I think that's hard to argue.
Yeah, I agree. I mean,
Even though he doesn't have the all-time wins, I mean, come on.
no, but that's yeah, like you said, that was like the guy that was like standing around. They're like, hey, want to coach a basketball team? Oh, sure, whatever. They can get some exercise. That's good for fitness. Like
yeah.
that was not, I mean, good for Doc Carlson. But yes, I think Jamie Dixon is definitely the runaway winner there in terms of who has that distinction.
You remember they beat UConn twice when they were ranked number 1? That was in the same season too, because they beat them, got ranked 1, and then they lost. I forget who they lost to while they were ranked 1, so they went down and they got to beat them again. I don't know, was that in the tournament that time but yeah, they beat UConn twice when they were number 1.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, the beating UConn always was the sweetest back then.
And can you I would say I don't know about like wrestling or swimming or volleyball, but I can say this for football and basketball. I don't know what the basketball stats are on Pitt playing number 1, but I still think this is like one of the few times Pitt is in either of the big sports beat a number 1 ranked team. So they've never done it in football, and I don't think they've done it in basketball more than this one time, or twice. So I mean, that's something they'll always have. So another big moment in Jamie Dixon coached moments there. We'll play the audio from this one too.
Down by 2, out of timeouts. In a game that has featured more bumps and bruises and cuts and scrapes than you could count.
Well, Pittsburgh, toward the end of a clock, they like to run an open set and get a run-out ball screen. Here it comes, involving Sam Young, but didn't get anything out of it.
Down to 7 seconds. Fields for 3. Oh! Duke out of timeouts. Shire again. Oh, it would have counted, but Pittsburgh wins. Him as the leader. The guy.
So if you couldn't catch all what was going on there, Levance Fields gets the ball and pulls his own Kemba Walker, but against Duke this time, and fakes a guy out of his shoes and hits a 3 that beats Duke. Was that in a tournament game? Not like an NCAA, but like a weird tournament. Wasn't it? It was like a weird tournament. They just had them.
Yeah, it was like the something classic or one of those like things that.
And it was like the middle of the Yeah, it was like the middle of the season too. It wasn't like that beginning of the season. You know, when they have. I think we watched this together, didn't we?
We may have, yeah.
Yeah, and that was a huge win because everybody, everybody hates Duke. I mean, I'm not that passionate about it, but I can understand why. I guess people just, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm one of the few people that didn't hate Duke. I used to always root for Duke back in the day. I was a fan of Coach K and Christian Laettner and Grant Hill and all those guys way back when, which, like you said, was not popular. Nobody else liked Duke, and people just loved to hate Duke. But it was a big deal because here we were beating Duke. Like, there was a time when you wouldn't even, like, Pitt wouldn't even be in the conversation of schools like Duke or UNC or, those big time college basketball schools. Like Pitt almost was like on another, almost like in another division of the sport, right? And here they are not only playing schools like that, but beating schools like that, being ranked high in the AP poll, being number 1 seed in the tournament. I mean, that was, it's hard to put into words how unfathomable that would have been, 3, 4, 5 years before Jamie Dixon, became the coach.
Oh yeah, definitely. Even in '99 when Howland first came, I don't think they would have been able to pull it off. And they beat Duke. I think I remember when they joined the ACC, they were beaten. I think they beat Duke again with him. Like they were beating all kinds of teams in the ACC. Because I remember that was towards the end of Dixon. Like Duke came up here, and like Pitt had a really good record that year in the ACC, and they beat Pitt and it was like I've never seen like normally Coach K doesn't get that animated, and he was really animated. So I think like, it was like a hit. Like the ACC got sick of Pitt just kind of because coming down there, and ACC basketball is like really, it's really big. Like it's always been more of a basketball conference than a football conference, but we'll get into that later. In staying with the good, in 2004, beating Wisconsin, and just for full, I don't like Duke or North Carolina. When they play, I could care less. If they could both lose, I would root for that. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. For some reason, Wisconsin keeps coming up in conversation, but they beat in 2004. They beat Wisconsin in the tournament, and I remember that Carl Krauser drove into the lane with like 4 fouls on him with like a couple seconds left and hit a big layup like under pressure while being guarded. It was a big win, and that was in the tournament against a pretty good Wisconsin team. So, I mean, and some of those other losses that we didn't cover, like they lost to like Oklahoma State when they were pretty good. They had, I forget who they had, that one point guard. They lost to UCLA like with Howland when Howland had went to UCLA, and like those 2 years, one of those 2 years when UCLA went to the championship game and lost to Florida. They lost to another team, then they were number 1 seed. So, like, I don't count those as bad losses. It's just like, okay, those teams were pretty good. And no, you couldn't pull off an upset. It would have been nice, but I don't know. I don't know what to tell you on that one. Off the field, though, and this is like another thing that really, like, when he left, like, I really just really broke my heart was like, do you remember when Jamie Dixon pulled people out of the car wreck on I-279? Do you remember that, Tim?
No, I actually don't.
Yeah, he was driving home and on 279, I guess up where like Channel 11 is, like where it makes that bend at the top of the hill, like a car had flipped over and he was driving home and he stopped and pulled over. And like people were trying to he was like helping people. He like ripped the windshield off and he got one person out. He couldn't get the other person out because they were stuck in their seatbelt. But like, yeah, he actually ended up cutting his hands a little bit. His wife was funny, made fun of him, called him a wuss. But he tried to like not even do any press conference on it or anything. And the news media went so nuts with it that they wouldn't let him. They pestered him till like I think it happened like a Saturday night or something or Sunday, and Monday he had to do a press conference on it. But just like a good person, he's a generally good person, and he really likes to be in Pittsburgh. And it just I think that's what made it hurt more is like we've had so many coaches that didn't want to be here or were just sleazebags or weren't the greatest of coaches. But this guy was a good coach. It still is a good coach. And wanted to be here and liked being here. So more good. Dixon was named 2010-2011 Sporting News National Coach of the Year. Pitt was Big East regular season champions 2004-2011. That's another thing they had never done that they did under Pitt. That was regular season. Then they run the conference in 2008, the conference tournament championship. So, I mean, just a lot of accolades for him while they were there. It was a very successful, tenure. We kind of started to debate it. Who was his best player? So, DeJuan Blair, I think, was the most successful in college. Levance Fields was probably his best point guard because I don't think Brandon Knight was more of a Howland guy.
Yeah,
so he really didn't he really didn't get to coach Brandon Knight. Steven Adams was the legit NBA talent, especially the fact that Steven Adams is still in the NBA. The only really one and done player Pitt has ever recruited or had, and he literally didn't. I mean, he was okay. I think he got voted ACC Rookie Player of the Year or something, but they didn't really. He didn't really make that much of an impact at Pitt. I always felt.
I feel like that happens in football too. Like you've had some guys go to the NFL who've maybe even had some success at the NFL level who you look back at their time at Pitt and it's like, I mean, they were decent, but they weren't, they weren't as good. I don't know. It's funny how that works, right? So, and then you have the opposite where the guy's a superstar in college, but then they're not good as a pro. So it's funny how those things shake out.
it's such a jump. Like, I'm sure I've said that before on our older podcast. Like, from high school to the college is a big jump, and it's just a big jump from college to the pro, and that's football and basketball. I'm sure. I mean, it's just the talent is so much better, and only there's so many players and so many colleges, and only a small percentage of those people end up at being professionals at the highest level. I mean, maybe you go to China or something, or somewhere overseas. But remember Aaron Gray, he was
Big
over
guy.
7 feet, and he wasn't that great. Like, he was like they molded him. That was another great coaching job by Jamie Dixon, and he really grew into like a pretty good player. Although I think he was on the Bradley team. I think he was on the team that lost to Bradley. I think, but he was still pretty good. Tim's favorite player, Carl Krauser. I'm a Carl Krauser fan. I'm probably like one of the few people. I think he's just one of the more competitive point guards. He wasn't like the greatest point guard to ever play a Pitt, but I put him top 5, and he was really good and really competitive. And like I said, he hit some big shots and won them some games. So.
And had a very, very punchable face.
He did have an attitude, but like sometimes you need that guy. You need that guy with that attitude to dribble the ball down the lane with 4 fouls in the NCAA tournament. You just got to have that guy, that's not afraid to do that. So, Sam Young, remember Sam Young was like, I forget how long he was in the NBA, but it seemed like there was a guy too. Like, I thought, oh, he'll be really good in the NBA, and he was like, he was okay. Like, Brad Wanamaker, that we talked about him. I think he's in the NBA. So, I mean, they did have their fair share. I left off Ronald Ramon. He was a nice 3-point shooter. Ashton Gibbs was probably their best 3-point shooter. So, I mean, who would you guess who would you say? I think DeJuan Blair was his best all-around player that he had.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I can't really disagree with that. I mean, DeJuan Blair was very good, and he was the one that you thought. And it's funny, his NBA career was not super long. I think it was a lot. If I remember correctly, Steve, it might have been due to injuries, but his NBA career maybe only lasted like 5 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And you would have thought it would have been longer. But yeah, I think DeJuan Blair you can put up there. Fields obviously, was kind of like, it felt like he was like the leader of that team for a while. So you could put him up there too.
Anybody I've forgotten that you can think of? I don't think of.
I mean, the rest of the guys that I can think of are Howland players, and I can't even remember if they were still there after Howland left. Like Julius Page and guys like that. I think that they were all gone when Howland left, but I don't remember exactly. And if they were around one more year, like you said, they're really Howland guys, not Dixon guys.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think DeJuan Blair was the most successful player of that era. And Steven Adams definitely is the most talented. He just didn't have the impact that I thought that DeJuan Blair had, and definitely didn't have the success they had. They definitely had more success on the court with Blair than they did with Adams. So Go figure that. So moving on to more sad topics again. So why did Jamie Dixon leave? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and one of them was let's set the way back, machine, Mr. Peabody, for 2013. So we go back in time to 2013, and Pitt moved out of the Big East. Actually, it was announced in 2011, and it took them 2 years to move completely. And they actually paid like more money, I think, to leave earlier. They were supposed to leave like a couple years later, but they actually paid the Big East more money. The chancellor and the administration had changed, and a guy named Scott Barnes was in charge. And I think Scott Barnes was only athletic director at Pitt for like maybe 2 years. So he lowered Dixon's buyout. And supposedly Barnes was this big like college basketball guy, and he's supposed to be this big expert. I'm not a Scott Barnes fan. I think he was pretty god awful, and he was here 2 years. He literally destroyed the football program. So TCU came in and they wanted to rebuild their program, so they bought out Jamie Dixon, and Jamie Dixon, who I don't think he really wanted to leave, left. So another reason was the New York City connection. Like once Pitt left the Big East, they didn't have the recruiting pipeline into New York like they used to. So they kind of had I mean, Pitt wasn't going to go down to like, they're not a national program. They're still very regional, and they weren't going to go down to, I don't know, Virginia or something and recruit people, or Texas or Chicago. I just don't see them doing that on a regular basis. Not like they did like back in the heydays of like the Dixon era. Like it seemed like everybody was from somewhere in the five boroughs, and they always did really well. They got some guys out of Philadelphia too. So I think Wanamaker's I think from Philadelphia, I think.
But you're right. It was like Dixon was kind of set up to fail. That would have he failed as badly as what happened after that, which I'm sure you're going to get into. But he was kind of set up to fail by them leaving the Big East. Now they really had no choice when they left the Big East, because the football conference had collapsed, and they had to find a place in the Power Five, or else they would have been, in some football conference with the dregs of, the college football world that can't compete.
Well, they'd be with UConn,
right?
Yeah.
So they didn't want that. They wanted to still be in a Power Five conference. You can debate whether that was good or bad. Obviously, their last year they were able to win that conference. So, say what you will there, but for basketball, them playing Duke in North Carolina and those types of schools in basketball, there really wasn't a good natural rivalry there. And then the recruiting, like you said, that was kind of the end of the New York recruiting, because that was the big deal. You could play in Madison Square Garden in the Big East tournament. That was one of the big hooks of recruiting all those kids from New York, and they just lost all that. So it stunk that it shook out that way. It stunk that the college football thing drove college basketball to the Pitt college basketball program to that point. The other thing I remember is, the whole TCU thing, like you said, it was kind of like, I don't know, it felt like it was just forced, like from all sides. And I remember I remember Barnes even coming out and like, he had talked to TCU, and Barnes was just very publicly like, oh, if he doesn't want to be here, forget him. And it's like, dude, it's like he wanted him gone. Like,
he wanted him out of there.
He wanted him out.
He wanted to hire his So this is ridiculous. It was ridiculous. And like Dixon found out the news about them leaving the Big East for the ACC on text messages and through the news. They didn't even have like the balls to call him and tell him, hey, we're changing conferences, by the way,
Yep.
So, I mean, I just don't understand that. And then, so Scott Barnes moves the team, and it was like, the only thing I compare it to is like what other like serious basketball school, like a Syracuse or UConn, or I'm trying to think of like even Duke. Like, would Duke let some athletic director and I'm sure, I don't know about those, but I'm sure Syracuse has had an athletic director that's been there for like 5 minutes, that's been there literally for a year, fire Jim Boeheim. Would any other school let that have like a legendary coach that's won all kinds of games, and you're just going to let a guy that's been here 5 minutes, has no connection to the school, fire your legendary basketball coach? That's still, and not fire, but just not make any effort to keep him. Like obviously, push him out the door, because he didn't get fired, but like you said, he got pushed out the door. And like, who would let that happen? I mean,
yeah, that's a good point. That's a good comparison. He was here for 5 minutes. And you're right. There's no way that would happen with like a Boeheim or a Krzyzewski
or Calhoun when he was in UConn.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, granted, you can't necessarily put Dixon in the same tier as a Krzyzewski or a Calhoun, but for Pitt standards, I mean, he was that guy, and it's just there's always been a lot of dysfunction managing the sports programs at the University of Pittsburgh, and I think that was just part of it.
And I've seen even in interviews where Dixon said, "Well, the management, he didn't call him. He said the administration changed, and that's when his relationship changed." And so obviously, when Norberg, it was Norberg left, and who's the new Gallagher came in, and I think that just changed so much. It was just a shame because, like I said, you had a decent person who was a good recruiter, a clean recruiter, and was a good person and wanted to be here. Like I don't think Pitt's ever had a coach outside of Dave Wannstedt. I can't think of any other person that they've had like that. And Dixon, quite honestly, won more than Wannstedt ever won. I mean, not ever, but I just, it's frustrating. It just frustrates me to no end. And there's a lot of people that didn't like Dixon at the end, especially the Gary McGee thing, and just not winning enough. But so the aftermath. So now he's left, and also like we were saying about like back then the ACC tournament was in Greensboro, North Carolina. Who wants to go to Greensboro, North Carolina? I mean, nothing against Greensboro. I'm sure it's a fine town, but you're not want to have a major basketball tournament there. Like, you would think the ACC would at least have had it in Charlotte. That's kind of like their major city, and it's still. But now, after all that, they moved it to Brooklyn, which still they can't even sell that out. So it's like the worst of all worlds. It's like they're not really getting any bump for New York for like the Pitts and Syracuse of the world, but they're not getting the ACC crowd from like Virginia and the Carolinas. So I think it's like when you try and the old if you try and compromise, you kind of leave everybody dissatisfied. So they should, and they can't have it at Madison Square Garden because that's where the Big East tournament is. So like they have it at this. Brooklyn's almost as half-assed as Greensboro. I think they'd be better doing it like Charlotte, or I can't think of like. I guess you can't have it in Atlanta, but I even having it in Pittsburgh would be, I think, better than Brooklyn. I mean, I don't know, but it's neither here nor there.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, it feels like a distant memory now. That Pitt was like the number one team in the country. Pitt was the number one seed in the NCAA tournament. That it's almost like that didn't even happen. It's like so because that was such a mirage of like, again, that was never Pitt. Our whole time growing up, that wasn't even like in like a space in your mind where you allowed a possibility of that, because they weren't that school. It would be like, I can't find a good comparison, but that wasn't even a remote possibility. And then it happened, and they had their window there, and they unfortunately didn't ever get to the Final Four. But then it's like it's over. And I think you're right. I mean, by the time that all went down, there were enough people that wanted Dixon gone anyway that it wasn't. So maybe that answers your question about how could you let an AD come in here and do that, because I think by that point, people were just like, okay, Dixon's not good anymore, and the recruiting's dried up, and we need to get new blood. There were enough people that had that opinion, and I think history maybe has shown that, that wasn't the case. It was very, you talked about Wannstedt. It was very similar to Wannstedt. By the time Wannstedt was gone, was he, he was a guy that wanted to be here, sure, but then, he kind of maxed out his potential. And was it better to get a new guy? Well, the new guys didn't work out, and same thing happened in basketball.
Yeah, well, you're leading nicely into the new guys. So they literally hired a coach worse than Jamie Dixon. Like, and it wasn't easy. Like, it wouldn't be easy to replace Jamie Dixon, but there were like they could have got the Millers who hadn't done all the cheating yet, or a lot of other people. They if they just would have paid some money, they probably could have got a lot of other people that at least bigger name or had a lot of success. But no, they hired Kevin Stallings because he was friends with Barnes, and they in the what they're that was always the scandal is the company they paid to do the search was like Barnes owned a Stockin or something or had some weird connection to. So it's like Pitt basically paid $1 million for them to not really look for anybody. And Stallings, he had a worse record than Dixon and like did not have half the success. And then when he came here, he had no success. He was here 2 years, and the 1 year they went 0-18 in ACC play. And I think he's still getting paid. He hasn't coached anywhere since. And I swear he just took the job here because his son was in the minor leagues with the Pirates, and he figured he could go and watch Pirate games in the off season and watch his son play. So, and that literally did happen. Like there was a game in New York, and like I remember they showed Kevin Stallings in the stands. It was like that was before Stallings got traded from the Pirates. So I guess the joke was on him. But it's just like it's just so finally they crack open the piggy bank or whatever, and they hire Jeff Capel, who I thought at the time would be a good recruit. He seemed like a good recruiter at Duke, but he's just been a disaster at Pitt. He can't recruit. He's not much of an in-game coach, and it's just they've been terrible for the last, Dixon left in 2016. They haven't even sniffed the tournament. Not even. I don't know if they've won more than 15 games since then in a season. I mean,
So I have here in front of me because I had this from a few years ago. In 2018, the New York Post did an ACC tournament preview. So they listed all the teams, their seeds, and then for each team they had a strength, a weakness, and then can win title if. So that was for every team in the ACC tournament.
And they had to do one for Pitt when they went in the winless in ACC.
Yeah, they went 0-18 in the ACC. So here's what the New York Post had for Pitt that year. Strength was showing up on time for the next game.
Well,
weakness was one word: basketball.
Basketball.
And can win title if was if every team dies laughing at the notion.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was the Kevin Stallings era of Pitt basketball. And yeah, you're right. His son eventually got traded because he was actually starting to get good. So the Pirates had to do something about that. But Capel, I was excited about Capel because I mentioned earlier I was a Duke fan back in the day, and Capel was one of the great Duke players back in the 90s. One of the best games I ever saw was the 95 game against UNC, where Capel hit just a miracle shot in, I think it was double overtime to send it to I think it was a triple overtime. So I was a big Capel fan. I thought, he was definitely like a Krzyzewski disciple. Might have been a guy that had he stuck around could have succeeded Krzyzewski. So you were excited about that get, and like you said, so far it has not really paid any kind of dividends. So unfortunate.
He got fired at Oklahoma before he went back to Duke too. And I guess the only time he had any success, and I mean, it's always like chicken or the egg when you make this. When he had a Blake Griffin at Oklahoma, he had success then. But I mean, you can't have success without good players. But you have to be like he hasn't recruited. And then like the three players he had they all got in an argument over like somebody's girlfriend or something, and that's why they all transferred. And that I think that kind of killed his coaching. Although, like I said, he's not the greatest in-game coach. So like that, I'd have to look up their record, but I doubt they've had more than 15 wins in any of the last 3 seasons. So, and I mean, you got to at least have 18 to 20 to have a chance to make the tournament or even the NIT. A final wrap up on this. Jamie Dixon, he was kind of a victim of his own success. And one article even says that he said, I've raised expectations very much. So he raised it from oh my goodness, we made the tournament to, oh my goodness, why aren't we winning in the tournament? Why aren't we making the Final Four? And it just, 10 years before they didn't make the tournament. Nevertheless, I don't think they had won a tournament game since the 70s. When he got there, they made the tournament 14 out of the next 15 years, and they made the Elite Eight, and they consistently made the Sweet 16 most years. So I don't know what else people wanted out of Pitt. Maybe it just he started to get stale. It would have been nice to see him have a Jim Boeheim kind of run here, but it wasn't to be.
It's very similar to kind of Bill Cowher's tenure with the Steelers, because when Bill Cowher came in and he won the division his first year after the miserable decade of the entire 1980s and beginning of the 90s, you were just so thrilled, oh my gosh, we're a good team again. This is tremendous. And then it very quickly turned into we're losing AFC championship games at home. Right, but Cowher was kind of able to write that really nice ending to his tenure because he eventually won the Super Bowl there at the end, and it would have been nice for Dixon to have some kind of nice, even if it would have been just making the Final Four, just to be able to write some kind of nice ending to that instead of just the way it went. So you're right, kind of a great time for Pitt basketball, but kind of sad to think back on it as well.
And Jamie Dixon's proved that he didn't forget how to coach, because he's taken TCU, a program that I don't think they had won a tournament game in 35 years. They've won 1 or 2 tournament games now since he's been there. So he hasn't forgotten how to coach. He's a good coach. And it's just, like I said, it's just a shame he couldn't, win a little bit more, have the administration just kind of pull, like I said, Syracuse or something, where you just tune out the critics and just say, whatever, we're sticking with our guy. As long as he's happy, we're happy, and he'll be here till he doesn't want to be here anymore. So, well, that's the book on Jamie Dixon. Hopefully Pitt basketball hires somebody that can turn it around, or maybe Cape will get lucky and find an NBA player under a rock somewhere. Thanks for listening. Keep giving us those likes on whatever service you listen us to. Word of mouth is great. Check us out on Twitter or on the web. And thanks for tuning in.